just start with the biggest question of all. What exactly is Native American culture? Well, the short answer is there isn't one. There never has been. To really understand this story, we've got to erase that idea of a single culture and really embrace the reality that there were hundreds. And what does that diversity actually look like today? It looks like this number, 574. That's how many federally recognized tribal nations exist in the United States right now. And each one is a sovereign entity. They have their own government, their own culture, their own laws. This isn't just ancient history, it's happening right now. To really get why things went so tragically wrong, we first have to appreciate the world that existed before everything changed. So let's start with a wide-angle view, a panorama of the cultural landscape of North America. Okay, so to make sense of this huge mosaic, academics often group nations into these cultural areas. They're basically regions where nations shared similar environments and traditions. So, for example, in the Pacific Northwest, you had nations known for amazing woodworking and salmon fishing. Meanwhile, out on the plains, cultures grew up around the bison. Now, these aren't meant to be rigid boxes, but they're a pretty helpful way to see the patterns across the continent. And, this cultural diversity wasn't just about food or art or location. It was woven right into the fabric of people's identity through language. And the sheer variety of languages spoken across the continent was just as vast. How diverse are we talking? Well, linguists have identified around 296 distinct indigenous languages just north of Mexico. And listen, these are not just different dialects. They fall into 29 totally separate language families. That means many of them are as different from each other as English is from Mandarin. It's incredible. All right, so you have this incredibly complex, vibrant mosaic of nations, and then everything is about to get shattered. The arrival of Europeans kicks off this profound clash of worlds, and the portrait of a continent is about to be redrawn forever. You'll often hear this period referred to by this very neutral-sounding term, the Columbian Exchange. And sure, while it did involve the transfer of things like potatoes and horses, for Native American cultures, it was overwhelmingly destructive. It brought devastating new diseases they had no immunity to, and it sparked conflict on a scale they had never seen. This slide really gets to the absolute heart of the conflict. This wasn't just a fight over territory. It was a collision of two fundamentally different ways of seeing the world. On one side, you've got cultures built around the idea of communal land and really complex kinship structures. And on the other, you have a worldview centered on private property and the nuclear family. These weren't just small differences. They were totally incompatible ideas that made conflict almost inevitable. Now, this clash of worldviews didn't just stay as an abstract idea. It got written down, and it became official U.S. government policy. And one particular piece of legislation, the Indian Removal Act, would set the stage for one of the most tragic, state-sanctioned events in all of American history. The path to this removal was just chillingly quick. In 1829, President Andrew Jackson makes it a core promise of his administration. Just 1 year later, the Indian Removal Act is the law of the land. The final piece of the puzzle was the Treaty of Nuakota in 1835. This was the document that supposedly ceded all Cherokee land. The problem? It was completely fraudulent, signed by a tiny group of people who had no authority to do so against the will of almost the entire Cherokee Nation. Just try to wrap your head around that number for a second. 7 million acres. This wasn't some minor border dispute. This was the entire ancestral homeland of the Cherokee Nation, signed away in a treaty that the vast majority of its own people knew was illegitimate. And just like that, the policy of removal became a brutal reality. What followed was a forced march of thousands of men, women, and children from their homes, an event that would become known to history as the Trail of Tears. This quote, it's from a survivor, and it gives us this raw, unfiltered glimpse into the absolute horror of that journey. This wasn't a relocation. It was a death march. People were forced to bury their loved ones in shallow, unmarked graves along the trail, and then just keep walking. The sheer scale of it is just difficult to imagine. A forced march, a lot of it done barefoot, through absolutely brutal weather, stretching for nearly 1,000 miles. They were driven from their homes in the southeast all the way to what we now call Oklahoma. And the final tally? That's the real tragedy. Of the thousands of Cherokee people forced on this march, it's estimated that 1/4, a quarter of the entire nation, died. Men, women, and children lost to disease, starvation, and exposure. It was a catastrophic loss of life. But the story doesn't end in Oklahoma. The legacy of this event and the treaties that caused it continues to echo all the way into the present day, all because of a promise that remains unfulfilled. So let's go back to that fraudulent treaty for a second. There was one provision tucked inside of it that was designed to make the whole terrible deal seem legitimate. It was a promise from the U.S. government to give the Cherokee Nation a permanent non-voting delegate in the House of Representatives, a voice inside the very government that was displacing them. Almost 200 years have passed since that treaty was signed, and that treaty obligation, it has never been honored. That seat in Congress has never been filled. It's not just some historical footnote, it is a living, breathing symbol of a promise made and a promise broken. And that leaves us with a really fundamental question, doesn't it? The Trail of Tears isn't some closed chapter in a history book. Its legacy is alive today in that empty seat in Congress, and it forces us to ask, how does a nation truly reconcile with its past? And maybe more importantly, what is the value of a promise